What does it mean when the most secretive weapons program in the entire country finishes early, and almost nobody outside a small circle of analysts even notices? Before we go any further, hit subscribe and tap that like button, because this story explains something happening quietly right now that will shape how you read every headline about Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea for years to come. Share it with someone who assumes nuclear weapons stopped changing after the Cold War, because that assumption is badly out of date. Let's start with the plain facts, because stories like this one get twisted online within hours of breaking. And this particular topic deserves better than that. The weapon is called the B-6113. It's the newest member of a nuclear gravity bomb family that stretches back more than 5 decades, making the B-61 line the longest-serving weapon design in the entire American nuclear arsenal. In the summer of 2026, the agency responsible for building America's nuclear stockpile announced something genuinely remarkable. Every sensitive internal component scheduled for completion that fiscal year had been finished 3 months ahead of schedule. Not delayed, not stalled, early. That announcement didn't dominate headlines the way missile strikes or troop movements usually do. It landed quietly, almost like a routine government press release. But people who track nuclear weapons programs for a living understood immediately what they were looking at. This wasn't a small bureaucratic milestone buried in a quarterly report. This was one of the fastest nuclear weapons development timelines the United States has managed since the height of the Cold War, back when the entire nation was organized around building these things quickly, at massive scale, with almost unlimited resources behind the effort. And here's the detail that makes this story genuinely hard to ignore. This progress isn't unfolding in isolation. It's happening while American aircraft are actively engaged in strikes against targets inside Iran, hitting command centers, radar sites, and supply routes in a live, ongoing military campaign. In the middle of that campaign, news breaks that a new nuclear weapon has just cleared a major production milestone ahead of plan. Coincidence? Almost. Certainly not exactly the simple story it looks like on the surface, but also not something worth waving away as meaningless either. The real explanation sits somewhere more complicated and honestly more interesting than either of those extremes. So let's slow down and actually understand what this weapon is, why it exists, and what its existence tells us about how the next few decades of global power are likely to be shaped. First, let's clear up a myth before it spreads any further. This is not a signal that the United States is preparing to drop a nuclear weapon on Iran. There's no public evidence this specific weapon has been assigned to any target in the current conflict. Nothing ties it to the Strait of Hormuz. Nothing connects it to any specific underground facility inside Iranian territory. If you've seen headlines suggesting otherwise, they're stretching this story well past what the actual facts support. What this really represents is something bigger and in some ways more unsettling than a single strike plan. It's a signal about how American military planners are thinking years, even decades, into the future, specifically about adversaries who have decided the safest place to hide their most valuable military assets is deep underground, buried behind reinforced concrete, protected by layered air defenses, betting that raw depth alone keeps them safe from anything short of a nuclear weapon. The B-6113 exists to make that particular bet a lot riskier. Here's something that surprises a lot of people when they first hear it. This program didn't start because of Iran. It didn't start because of any single crisis. At all. Officials first revealed the concept publicly back in late 2023, well before the current conflict began. At the time, defense leaders described it as a measured response to a security environment that had been shifting gradually for years, not a reaction to any specific event. They've stayed remarkably consistent on that point ever since. The decision to build this weapon came from years of quiet observation, watching rival governments pour money and effort into digging their most important assets deeper underground, watching how seriously other countries were investing in hardening bunkers, command centers, and missile storage sites, specifically against the kind of conventional weapons America already has in enormous numbers. In other words, this weapon exists because other countries changed their defensive posture first. That's a pattern worth remembering because it repeats throughout military history. One side hardens its defenses, the other side eventually builds something capable of getting through them. Then the cycle starts over again. Now let's clear up some language, because getting this part wrong completely changes how people understand the story. You'll see this weapon casually described online as a tactical nuclear bomb. That description is misleading, and it matters why. The broader B-61 family has included both smaller tactical versions, meant for use closer to an active battlefield, and larger strategic versions meant for far bigger, more consequential missions. The B-6113 specifically falls into that strategic category. It's being certified for delivery only by strategic bomber aircraft, and it will be stored domestically rather than forward deployed overseas the way some earlier, smaller variants have been. Under American nuclear doctrine, that placement alone tells you almost everything. This isn't a weapon built to be carried under a fighter jet and used against a frontline target the way an ordinary bomb might be. It belongs to the small, carefully managed category of weapons meant to influence entire wars, entire governments, entire questions about national survival. It sits in the deterrent tier of the arsenal, not the battlefield tier. There's another word that trips people up too: gravity bomb. That phrase sounds almost old-fashioned, like something pulled from a black and white newsreel, but it simply describes how the weapon reaches its target. It's dropped from an aircraft and falls under gravity, rather than flying under its own power, the way a cruise missile or ballistic missile does. Don't let the simple name fool you into picturing some crude, unguided device from decades ago. Modern gravity bombs, including this, 1. Carry genuinely sophisticated guidance systems. The B-6113 inherits many of the same safety and precision features developed for its immediate predecessor, including a modern tail kit that dramatically improves accuracy compared with older, unguided designs. If you're starting to notice just how much nuance sits underneath a headline you'd normally scroll straight past, that's genuinely the whole point of this video. So drop a comment telling me one detail you didn't already know, because it helps me figure out exactly where to dig deeper next time. Accuracy might matter. Here, more than in almost any other category of weapon in the entire arsenal. A weapon that lands closer to its intended target doesn't need to rely on sheer explosive size to compensate for a wide margin of error. It can concentrate its destructive force precisely where planners want it, instead of spreading uncertainty across a much larger area. That precision genuinely increases effectiveness against hardened, well-defended targets. But don't mistake precision for safety. This is still a nuclear detonation we're talking about. Extreme heat, massive overpressure, ionizing radiation, and possible radioactive fallout depending on conditions. None of that disappears just because the guidance system improved. Precision changes where a weapon lands. It doesn't change what the weapon fundamentally is. Now, for the number that grabs everyone's attention. Public reporting places this weapon's warhead lineage close to an older, higher yield design within the B-61 family. Outside analysts who track these programs closely estimate the upper end of its potential yield somewhere in the range of a few hundred kilotons, with some estimates suggesting it could be roughly 20 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Sit with that number for a second. 20 times. But before your imagination runs too far ahead, there's something crucial to understand. The government hasn't published an exact maximum yield figure, which is fairly normal for weapons in this category, and any specific number circulating online should be treated as an informed estimate rather than an official fact. Here's something equally important that often gets lost in the shock of a big number. Multiplying explosive energy by 20 doesn't mean multiplying destruction by 20. Terrain, altitude at detonation, weather, the height of the blast, and the strength of nearby structures all shape the real-world outcome in ways that don't scale along a simple, straight line. That said, this shouldn't be underestimated either. Even accounting for all those variables, a weapon in this yield range could still devastate a large military complex and cause catastrophic damage well beyond its immediate target zone. This is not a weapon to minimize in either direction. It's powerful, and it's also more complicated than any single headline number can fully capture. Understanding the actual science behind this weapon changes how you see it completely. This isn't simply a bigger version of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That earlier weapon worked through nuclear fission, splitting heavy atoms apart and releasing the energy trapped inside their bonds. A comparatively simple generation of weapon design by modern standards. Higher yield weapons of this newer generation are generally thermonuclear, meaning they use a fission explosion purely as a first stage trigger designed to create the extreme heat and pressure needed to ignite a second stage involving nuclear fusion. The same basic process that powers the sun, except released here in an uncontrolled fraction of a second rather than unfolding gradually over billions of years. That two-stage design is what allows a modern weapon like this to produce vastly more explosive power than the comparatively simple atomic weapons of the 1940s ever could. The B-6113 belongs to that later, more advanced era of weapons engineering, and its particular blend of compact size, guided precision, and adjustable yield is exactly what makes military planners view it as strategically significant. Here's the question people eventually ask, usually within the first few comments on any video like this one. Can a weapon like this actually destroy a deeply buried military facility? The honest answer resists the simple version most people want to hear. The B-6113 isn't publicly described as a dedicated Earth-penetrating bunker buster. That role belongs to a related weapon in the same family, one that does have Earth-penetrating capability. And even that weapon can't simply drill hundreds of feet through solid rock, the way movies tend to portray it. Earth penetration runs into brutal physical limits almost immediately. A weapon hitting the ground at extremely high speed experiences enormous structural stress and push that speed too far, and it risks destroying itself on impact before it can function properly. Fail to penetrate deep enough in the other direction, and a large share of the detonation's energy simply escapes upward and outward instead of concentrating underground where it's actually needed. So does that mean a nuclear weapon is powerless against a deep underground facility? Not exactly. Even without directly reaching an inner chamber, the shockwave from a detonation can travel through surrounding rock and soil, collapsing tunnel entrances, severing ventilation and power systems, cracking support structures, burying critical equipment under tons of rubble. In practical terms, that can functionally disable a facility, even if the innermost chamber technically survives the blast intact. Here's the deeper truth military planners understand. Better than almost anyone else. The deeper and better engineered a target is, the less certain any single strike becomes, nuclear or otherwise. That's exactly why defense planners spend enormous effort studying geology, construction methods, burial depth, access tunnels, and hidden secondary exits long before nuclear options ever even enter the conversation. A nuclear weapon isn't automatically the perfect solution just because it happens to be the biggest tool available, repeated conventional. Strikes can often collapse entrances and support systems without ever crossing the nuclear threshold. Cyber operations, intelligence infiltration, and special operations raids frequently offer alternative paths to disabling a hardened site just as effectively without carrying the enormous political and moral weight of a nuclear strike. Nuclear options only become genuinely relevant in serious military planning when leaders conclude a target is important enough and hardened enough that nothing else in the arsenal can reliably reach it. That's precisely where this weapon seems designed to fit. Officials have publicly described it as providing additional options against certain harder large area military targets. Notice that phrase, large area. This isn't built around striking a single isolated bunker. It's aimed at something broader, sprawling military installations, hardened command complexes, dispersed missile sites, strategic facilities where one high-yield detonation could functionally disable several connected elements across a wide footprint instead of requiring separate strikes against every individual piece. Delivery matters just as much as the warhead itself, and this is where things get genuinely interesting from a strategy standpoint, not just a technical one. The B-6113 is expected to be carried by the B-2 Spirit and eventually by the B-21 Raider, currently entering service. Both aircraft were purpose-built to penetrate heavily defended, contested airspace without being detected. That stealth and range combination gives a bomber-delivered weapon like this something no missile can truly offer, no matter how advanced its guidance system. A bomber can be launched as a deliberate signal. It can be held on station for hours. It can be turned back before any weapon is ever released without irreversibly committing to an attack. That flexibility makes a nuclear-capable bomber two things simultaneously: a physical weapon and a political message. Two completely different tools folded into a single aircraft. That dual nature sits at the center of how this entire category of weapon actually functions in the real world. It's not just about destruction. It's about signaling intent, capability, and resolve without ever needing to pull the trigger at all. Quick pause before we get into the timeline that's genuinely shocked seasoned defense analysts. Think about how many weapons programs you've heard about that finish early. In an industry famous for delays and budget overruns, this program is doing the exact opposite, and if that surprises you as much as it surprised the people who track this stuff for a living, hit that like button now, because it genuinely helps this breakdown reach more people who need to understand what's actually happening here. Let's talk about the pace of this program, because it genuinely stands out even against a defense industry not exactly known for moving fast. The first fully completed production unit rolled off the assembly line in May of 2025, nearly a full year ahead of the original internal target date. Then, in July of 2026, the agency responsible for nuclear weapons production announced that every sensitive internal component scheduled for the current fiscal year had been finished 3 months early. But one of those components is something called a canned subassembly, a technical name for one of the most sensitive and tightly controlled parts inside a modern two-stage thermonuclear weapon, directly tied to the weapon's secondary stage. When a unit like that receives its official certification, sometimes described inside the program using a specific internal seal of approval, it means the component has cleared every quality and reliability requirement necessary for actual inclusion in the nuclear stockpile, not a testing environment. The real thing. It would be easy and inaccurate to read that early announcement as evidence the United States suddenly rushed an entire nuclear weapons program into existence purely as a reaction to the war with Iran. That's simply not what happened. The first production unit had already been completed more than a year before the current campaign against Iran ever began. The foundation for this program was well underway long before this specific conflict started. What the more recent announcement actually reflects is a scheduled internal production milestone landing ahead of its own already accelerated timeline, which still matters enormously. It's just not a panic response to current headlines, no matter how tempting that narrative might feel. Think about what it actually takes to finish something like this early. Nuclear weapons production depends on specialized materials that are difficult to source and handle safely. It depends on extraordinarily secure facilities that take years to build and certify. It depends on uncompromising quality control, because there's zero room for error in this line of work. And it depends on a narrow, highly specialized pool of people with exactly the right technical expertise, a workforce that isn't easy to expand quickly, no matter how much funding gets thrown at the problem. Finishing meaningfully ahead of schedule under those constraints is a genuine institutional achievement. It signals that the United States is successfully rebuilding a nuclear production base that had slowed considerably in the decades following the Cold War, and it sends a fairly unambiguous message to every government watching American military capability right now, whether they're an ally or a rival. Here's something equally important that often gets lost in the excitement of a new weapon story. This program does not increase the total size of the American nuclear arsenal. The United States intends to produce this weapon within the number of similar bombs already planned, meaning some previously scheduled production of an older variant is simply being replaced by production of this newer one instead. The goal isn't accumulating more weapons. It's changing the mix of capabilities available at any given moment, trading some planned lower yield precision weapons for a comparable number of higher yield precision weapons instead. This connects directly to something else happening quietly in the background: the eventual retirement of the largest gravity bomb still active in the American arsenal, an older design with a maximum yield reported in the range of roughly 1 megaton, several times larger than even the higher publicly estimated yield of this new weapon. The United States has been steadily moving that older bomb toward retirement for years now. This new weapon doesn't fully replace that enormous raw explosive power. What it offers instead is a newer, more accurate, and more operationally flexible option for at least some of the missions planners worry could otherwise be left uncovered once the older weapon eventually leaves service entirely. So who actually gets to decide when a weapon like this is used? American nuclear policy doesn't publish a simple checklist, and that ambiguity is intentional rather than an oversight. The long-standing position has been that nuclear weapons would only be considered under extreme circumstances, specifically to defend the vital interests of the United States, its allies, or its partners. The authority to order that use rests with the president alone. Congress doesn't need to vote before a nuclear use order can be issued, although the military chain of command is required to verify that any such order is both authentic and lawful before it can actually be carried out. That verification step exists as a safeguard, but the decision itself is remarkably concentrated in a single office. In practical terms, actually using a weapon like this would rank among the most consequential decisions in modern history, weighing military necessity against civilian casualties, weighing radioactive fallout against battlefield outcomes, weighing the reactions of allied nations against the very real danger of a far wider regional or even global escalation. Against Iran specifically, the threshold would sit especially high, for a reason worth stating plainly and clearly. Iran does not currently possess a declared operational nuclear arsenal of its own. Using an American nuclear weapon against a state that isn't itself nuclear armed would break a taboo that has held without exception since 1945. That decision carries the potential to isolate the United States diplomatically, trigger a wave of retaliation across the wider region, put American forces stationed throughout the Middle East in far greater danger, and quite possibly push other governments watching closely toward pursuing nuclear weapons of their own as insurance against exactly this kind of precedent being set. That's precisely why the far more likely function of a weapon like this isn't battlefield use at all. It's deterrence, plain and simple. We're a little more than halfway through this story, and honestly, this next part is the piece most coverage skips entirely, because it requires actually explaining how deterrence works instead of just repeating scary numbers. If you're still with me, that already puts you ahead of most people scrolling past this topic online. So let's talk about deterrence properly, because it's the real engine behind everything we've covered so far. The entire purpose of a deterrent weapon is to manufacture uncertainty inside an adversary's mind, and that uncertainty does most of its real work long before any weapon is ever actually used. Think about it from the other side for a moment. A government pouring enormous resources into building a deep underground bunker has to seriously ask itself whether that bunker is actually deep enough anymore. A commander moving critical military assets underground has to ask whether those assets can genuinely survive an American strike under worst-case conditions. A nuclear-armed rival watching all of this unfold has to ask whether even its most hardened, most carefully protected facilities remain meaningfully out of reach. Deterrence works partly through outright fear, but just as much it works through sustained doubt. An adversary doesn't need to know precisely how or when a weapon like this might be used. It only needs to genuinely believe the capability is real, that a credible delivery platform exists to carry it, and that a president could plausibly authorize its use under sufficiently extreme conditions. That belief alone changes behavior. It shapes where a country decides to build its most important facilities, how deep it digs, how many billions it spends on concrete and steel, and how confident its military leadership feels about its own survivability in a worst-case scenario. All of that happens without a single weapon ever leaving American soil. One quick thing before we get into the last stretch of this story. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding defense policy properly instead of just reacting to a scary thumbnail. So consider leaving this video running in the background while you finish up whatever you're doing. Because the next few minutes tie every piece we've covered together into something genuinely worth knowing. The ongoing war with Iran gives all of this immediate real-world relevance, but that relevance shouldn't distort the actual facts of the situation. This new weapon is not a normal tool being reached for in the current campaign around the Strait of Hormuz. It's not a substitute for cruise missiles, conventional bunker-busting bombs, naval blockades, or the ongoing suppression of enemy air defenses. It functions as a strategic reserve, held back specifically for a crisis scenario in which a future president concludes the ordinary conventional toolkit is genuinely no longer sufficient. Right now, the United States still has an extensive menu of conventional options available and actively in use, continuing to strike missile forces, command centers, naval assets, logistics routes, air defenses, and underground entrances, tightening a maritime blockade, layering in cyber and intelligence operations, reinforcing regional allies, repositioning forces. All of this happens without ever approaching the nuclear threshold. But here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Every single one of those conventional strikes still carries an implicit message about where the ceiling actually sits. Iran is being shown, strike by strike, that its military infrastructure can be mapped, isolated, and systematically dismantled using entirely conventional means. This new weapons program adds a quieter, considerably darker undertone running beneath that entire campaign. It tells Iran, and it tells every other government watching from a safe distance, that the United States is simultaneously modernizing the specific category of weapons it deliberately holds in reserve for the most extreme wars imaginable. The existence of this weapon isn't evidence Washington is preparing to actually use a nuclear weapon against Iran. It's evidence Washington wants every current and future adversary to understand one thing clearly. Even the deepest, most heavily fortified target in the world may no longer sit as far beyond reach as its builders once assumed. Now here's the part of this story almost nobody's talking about, and it might be the most important piece of the entire picture. This weapon is not an isolated project. It's one of 6 separate warhead modernization efforts currently running in parallel across the agency responsible for America's nuclear stockpile. And according to that agency's own public reporting, every single one of those 6 programs is currently tracking ahead of its projected schedule. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small detail. It might be the biggest story hiding inside this entire topic. For decades, following the end of the Cold War, America's nuclear production infrastructure was widely described, including by government auditors themselves, as aging, understaffed, and in some cases barely capable of maintaining the existing stockpile, let alone developing new capabilities on any kind of accelerated timeline. Facilities fell behind. Expertise thinned out as an older generation of nuclear engineers retired without enough people trained to replace them. The entire system slowed to a crawl for the better part of 30 years. A production enterprise finishing 6 modernization programs simultaneously, ahead of schedule, is a completely different signal than a single weapon quietly entering service. It points toward a broader institutional recovery, one that foreign intelligence services and defense ministries around the world are almost certainly tracking just as closely as this individual weapon. That kind of institutional recovery rarely happens by accident. Rebuilding a specialized manufacturing base after 30 years of decline requires sustained funding across multiple administrations, new investment in aging facilities, and years spent training a fresh generation of engineers to replace the ones who retired without successors ready to take their place. None of that shows up in a single dramatic headline. It shows up gradually, in exactly the kind of quarterly milestone report most people scroll straight past, which is part of why the story matters more than its quiet rollout might suggest. Whatever happens next in the war with Iran, that underlying industrial story isn't going away. It's likely to keep shaping how the United States talks about deterrence long after this particular conflict has run its course. Presidents will change, conflicts will end, and new ones will begin. But a rebuilt nuclear production base doesn't disappear when a headline fades. It becomes a permanent fact on the ground, quietly reshaping the balance of power for decades. So step back for a moment and look at the whole picture together. A weapon finished ahead of schedule, a production agency hitting 6 modernization milestones early, all at once. A stockpile that isn't growing in total size, but is quietly becoming more accurate, more flexible, and more capable of reaching targets that used to feel untouchable. A retirement plan already underway for the largest gravity bomb America has ever fielded. And all of this unfolding in the background of an active military campaign that most of the world is watching, through the narrow lens of daily headlines about airstrikes and missile intercepts. That's the real story here. Not a single bomb, not a single conflict, but a quiet, methodical rebuilding of capability that's been unfolding for years, largely outside the spotlight, until a moment like this one drags it briefly into view. And here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. When a nation spends years quietly rebuilding its most extreme category of weapons, not to use them, but to make sure everyone believes it could, what does that tell us about the world we're actually living in right now? Not the world of daily headlines and breaking news alerts, but the deeper, slower world of decisions made years in advance, decisions that shape how safe or unsafe every government on Earth feels about its most protected secrets. Deterrence has always worked this way, quietly, patiently, through belief rather than action. The weapon rarely needs to be used for it to change everything. Its mere existence is often enough to reshape how the most powerful people on the planet think, plan, and calculate risk, long before any decision ever reaches a president's desk. This particular weapon will likely never be dropped. Most nuclear weapons in history never are, but its existence already changes the math for every government that has ever considered burying its most important secrets deep underground and hoping that depth alone would be enough. That's the real power of a weapon like this, not what it does, what it makes other people believe it might do. And that belief, quiet, invisible, and impossible to measure precisely, may end up shaping global power far more than any single airstrike ever could. If this video helped you understand something you hadn't fully grasped before, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and share it with someone who deserves the full picture instead of just another scary headline, because stories like this one rarely announce themselves loudly. They sit quietly in a government press release, waiting for someone to actually explain what they mean.